Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Viola, for sorting out my microphone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and it's a pleasure to be here with this esteemed panelists who come from a wide range of different backgrounds, and we're going to be having a conversation today on refugees, climate change, and sexual violence, addressing vulnerabilities and building resilience. It's a pretty broad topic, so we're going to try and narrow it down to some clear strategies, clear conversations, and examples of work that is going on to mitigate, adapt, and address the impacts of climate, conflict, and economic disasters all over the world. So let's get straight into it. I'll start by asking my guests to introduce themselves. So I'll start with you, Manira.
I'm Manira Alva. I work with Vital Voices, a Washington, D.C.-based NGO that works with girls and women leaders across the world, across all verticals, and it's one of the most exciting things to be doing.
Thank you, Manira. Anik?
Yes, hello. I'm Monique Wibben. I'm the Anna Lindh Professor for Gender, Peace and Security at the Swedish Defence University.
Thank you. Luca?
I'm Luca Frattini. I'm a career diplomat. 30 years I've been career diplomat, 20 in the bilateral sector and the last 10 in multilateral affairs, including at the Rome-based UN agencies and lately at the OSCE, where I served in Vienna for 6 years, and now I'm the coordinator for Italy on women, peace and security, but also youth, peace and security and mediation policies.
Claire?
Hello, Mia Brahma. I am Claire Hutchinson. I am founder of Redhead Consultancy, but previously I started my women, peace and security journey right here in Kosovo with UNMIK back in 2003. And I work as an expert on women, peace and security and human security.
Thank you so much. Viola?
Hello, my name is Viola van Kramon. I'm currently a member of the European Parliament. I have the honor to be the rapporteur from the European Parliament for Kosovo, working on the Western Balkans, working a lot in Eastern Europe. I was, in '91, the one founded an NGO dealing with people in the rural areas in Eastern Europe, and I'm very glad to be invited to this great panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just a little bit about me. I run a consultancy now working on advocacy with social justice actors, but have spent most of my career working with organizations who are leading the work on gender justice and social justice in different parts of the world. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's a pleasure today, and it's a pleasure to be in this conversation with you all. So just to set us up for this conversation, the world is grappling with multiple crises at the moment, whether that's economic, climate, or conflict. And we all know that women and girls carry the biggest burden of these crises. We know that when economic crises hit, we see a spike in domestic violence. When climate disasters occur or conflicts occur, we see a surge in sexual violence and human trafficking. And we know that grassroots actors and women-led movements are at the forefront of solutions and strategies to address, adapt, and mitigate the impact of these crises. In fact, there is a lot more global recognition of the role that these grassroots actors play, but that recognition is not always matched with funding and with real commitments. So to kick us off, I'm going to throw it over to Manira. Manira, you work through Vital Voices. You have a network of women who are leading change in their communities. So can you talk to us a little bit about what are the qualities that we need right now, and why are local women leaders the best place to lead change in the context of climate and conflict disasters?
Thank you for that question. I want to really start by thanking the President of Kosovo, the government, and her people for this initiative, and especially the whole idea of climate change also now being seen through the lens of security. So I work with girls and women leaders. We have a network of 20,000 girls and women around the world, and there are a few what I call, I wouldn't say traits, but values or principles that we see almost across the board. They definitely have a driving force, something that is keeping them going in the face of adversity. There is a bold idea there, something that is really different, and one wants to kind of push through. They have strong roots in their communities, which means they literally know what is it that is impacting them, who is the last person in that community, and how are they being impacted. They're always ready to unite across lines that divide. And finally, and most importantly, it's about paying it forward. It's not them dragging themselves alone, but their whole community. So the women and girls that I have worked with, I have seen this very clearly over the last many years, so to say. Now, when it comes to climate, we are here in Pristina 25 years ago. You all were in the midst of this deadly conflict that saw 500,000 refugees, saw sexual violence, saw everything that kind of adds up to the disproportionate impact on girls and women. 25 years later, we are sitting and we're going to see this play out in the climate crisis, right? We're going to see similarities and we are going to see mutations. We are going to see, as you said, trafficking. We're going to see violence. We are going to see this huge displacement. I think UNHCR has said about 216 million by 2050, which they are saying is maybe a safe number. But at the end of the day, what girls and women leaders do, as I have seen from our network, is that they're using similar methodologies to make sure that their reaction comes from a very survivor-centric and a human-centered space. It is not a refugee that they see, it is a leader, it is a person. They see them, I would say, as human resources as opposed to a human burden that has to be accommodated. We worked very closely with Georgetown, Women for Women, and kind of helped move 2,000 odd girls and women leaders from Afghanistan out of Afghanistan to not Kosovo, but neighboring Albania. And it was in that whole journey that I saw how differently that could be done, right? We did not just go to the girl and woman leader and say, we can evacuate you. We recognized that they were not going to leave without close family members, right? And it was literally us having to tell funders, they are going to decide if they want to leave, and if they want to leave, who are they going to leave with? Now, in different situations, in terms of refugees, right? Are we ready to see families moving? Are we ready to see them being integrated? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves. We ensured that in Albania, they had the food they were used to. We ensured there was psychosocial service support. We ensured that the children were being taken care of as well. And that is really what girls and women do differently. They're looking at these little aspects that make all the difference. And in the years to come, we know that, it's conflict, it's crisis, it's linked to security, yes. We know women are the last to leave security negotiation tables. Similarly, we know women are the last to leave their homes. No one really wants to leave, but they're the last ones left behind. And that makes them more fragile and vulnerable. And I just want to share 2 or 3 examples of some of the women in our network. One, for example, recognized that she could actually create this network of using refugees as translators. There was a big gap in certain languages, and she came from an area where, there was aid that needed to go to that country. There were NGOs going, but there was a language gap. And she set up this organization that matched translators to development, then to corporates, and it's booming, it's thriving, it's a simple idea, right? Similarly, women leaders who have created education on tech platforms for displaced folks, Ukrainian children in Jordan, to make sure that education is uninterrupted despite whatever the crisis is. So it's really looking at, quite simply, not just human-centered, but putting the last person, which is very often the woman and girl, the marginalized community, the one with disability, putting them at the center of solutions.
Thanks so much, Manira. And I know I work very closely with a lot of the women's funds, the funds who are driving resource to a lot of these local actors. And you can see always that those closest to the communities and closest to the issues are the ones who have or are able to come up with these solutions. But the money and connecting the money to that work is always the biggest barrier. What has been your experience of that? Is that still a big barrier? Are you seeing it shift at all?
I have a page full of statistics. I'm not going to go into them. We all know that we get the least amount of money, right? Out of every dollar, what is it, some 0.1%. So we see it as a challenge, but we have figured that to convince people, you need data, you need research, you need to be able to make the case that it makes economic sense for you to make this investment. So it's what we know intuitively, instinctively. So we are really, I would say, investing in data. We are investing in making the case that more money needs to be in the hands of girls and women. So we are also relying on historic data. For example, if we know now that peace deals negotiated by women have this longer lasting time frame. So similarly, we know that countries who have more women in their parliaments have stronger climate laws, better climate laws. We know that women who work with budgets in local communities, the money goes more towards human development. So we know these things. So it's now a question of doing deep data-driven research to make that case and to explain. I mean, I don't expect it to happen overnight, but we find that people across the table are a little more receptive to what we are saying makes more economic sense, because they're seeing it across different sectors. Fingers crossed, that's all I can say.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Thank you, Manira. Anik, I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to pick up on a thread of what Manira said earlier, which is that some of the conflicts today, even if they're caused by climate, the impacts on women and girls are very similar to the conflicts, or crises that we had many years ago. And so it would be great if you could talk about a little bit from your work about the solutions and approaches to security that you're seeing, both before, during, and after crises, and what are some of the sort of networks or mechanisms to share strategies from different crises, and how is that being done?
Yeah, thank you, and also thank you so much for the organizing team here and the president for inviting us. And I have to say I'm really, really very impressed with the focus on sexualized violence here. And also I just came from the panel on male survivors. I think these are topics that are not talked about enough, and so I really want to commend Kosovo in general for this focus. And I want to also throw in a little bit of extra, which is something that I've talked about with the Ukrainian activists. So this is one of the sort of conversations that we as feminist scholars are having. We're trying to have transnational conversations, and we're trying to have them, not just afterwards, basically, which is often what happens. We are too late. We react in the aftermath, but actually to have these conversations now and have them across, for example, the sort of experiences from the other war in Europe that happened recently, or wars that we sort of forgot conveniently when the sort of full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened, which is, of course, the wars of the former Yugoslavia, including the war here, and to really connect people who have the experience from those previous wars, and I know that there's a lot of building going on here in the Western Balkans across difficult terrains, but how do we also bring this further into sort of Eastern and Europe, and how can those of us who are located in other places who might have more resources to do the research, but also I'm based in Sweden. Sweden's very active internationally, supporting various efforts. Like, how do we bring these conversations together? And I actually think that feminist networks often are able to do things that governments maybe aren't able to do. And I want to point here to also the inclusion, not just of women. We often get stuck on women. So we've moved here today also towards men. But I also want to have us think more broadly about gender, about other communities, LGBTQI communities. This is a big issue also in Ukraine. So if we're thinking about these various issues, whether it's refugees, climate change, etc., and we think that, you were just mentioning the marginalized of the marginalized, right? So if we broaden our perspective and think about the intersections of gender and sexuality, but also gender and religion and ethnicity, of course, which people are very familiar with here in the Western Balkans, we see that, not to say that there is a hierarchy of suffering as much, but that actually when we really diversify our perspective and we include, and I think that this is what sort of feminist scholars and activists are doing, we're sort of pushing, right? Let's push a little bit beyond the women peace and security agenda to be much more intersectional. And so this sort of learning from each other, I think is one of the strengths of feminist communities. So I think that would be something that I would like to sort of also bring here and encourage all of us to think about how we then bring those sort of more civil society or academic conversations in conversation with the governmental conversations with sort of multilateral conversations as well. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. And are you seeing, you talk about these feminist approaches to security, are you seeing that being taken up by many different governments or by the WPS agenda in different regions? Anywhere that you're seeing it work really well?
Well, I think we see like it's sort of elements here and there. So Sweden, you used to have a feminist foreign policy. Germany now has one. Maybe our colleague will say something about this. And so as part of those kind of efforts, we're seeing funding going to those kind of organizations. But we're also seeing the reverse. Yeah. So I think it's a constant struggle, a sort of back and forth to actually, sort of make the change. And so I think what we've already heard from Maria is that we are, sort of constantly also innovating. We're doing a lot of sort of free labor in a lot of these areas. But I think all of the people here who've been attending these 2 days know that we just keep going anyway.
I hear you, and I know that so much of the work of feminist movements is on holding the line on some of these policies that have taken a long time to get there, yeah. And you see what happens and how quickly things can be reversed with the change in government and so on. So, yeah, the work of some of these feminist groups and local actors is often on that accountability piece and holding the line, so it's critical. Thank you very much, Annick. Coming to you, Claire. So we know the climate crisis has created a new form of refugee, the environmental refugee, and it's forcing people, especially women, into dangerous and often violent situations, and into a status where they're often even more at risk of sexual violence. So from there, can you talk about why it is so critical to integrate gender into climate change, especially from a security perspective?
So thank you for that. And I want to echo my fellow panelist friends, by saying a big thank you and commending the integration here of climate change into what is usually a marginalized subject. Climate change and women, peace and security agendas are very similar. They're very similar because there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of political engagement on them, and there's a lot of support, but you cut through it, there's not a lot of commitment and there's no money. Mm-hmm. And so they have a synergy in the mandates as they stand. But a lot of people will say there is no difference. Why would gender be in climate change? Because if you have a flood, everybody is going to be affected. But there's a huge disproportionate impact for women and men in any point of a climate or crisis disaster. In fact, some studies say women are 14 times more likely to be affected negatively. So I want to give you a couple of examples of this, because a lot of people don't look at the differences or don't take notice of the differences. So some of the gendered impact can be in areas, and we saw this in the Pakistan floods, in conservative communities where women had to wear certain clothes. They drowned because they couldn't get out their houses, because their clothes were restrictive. Some closed communities where women, and we saw this in Afghanistan, couldn't leave houses without a male guardian, were trapped in places where they were killed because of climate disasters. Climate change or environmental change also brings out the more patriarchal structures and patriarchal policies, so that we have women who starve to death when food insecurity takes place because they have to eat after the man of the house. These are all things that happen across the world, and as climate change is changing and becoming more frequent, we are seeing more frequent impacts that are really negative for women and children. We also especially see an increased and exponential rise in sexual violence. And sexual violence for women, and it's in any crisis. We saw this with COVID as well. But in terms of climate change, or when there are areas that are at risk, the fear from the community increases, and therefore the violence against women, which is based on fear, also increases. So we know that women are dreadfully impacted by the violence against their bodies. But on the other hand, in terms, and this is where we have to not essentialize women, to think of women as victims and not able to help themselves in crisis. The linkage between national security and climate change and gender is not explored enough, and I think we need to do much more to look at this. So we take the case of northern Mali in the 1970s when there was a drought. The drought made the men leave. They all went to Libya, and then they worked with a man called Gaddafi. And the women were left alone. And the idea, as many people here from Kosovo know, you get remittances when you have members of your family go away and they send back remittances. Well, the remittances stopped. So women were left in northern Mali with a drought, with no resources and no money. And the only people that helped these women was an armed group who helped them with food and sustenance for their kids and whatever. That armed group became Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, a known terrorist organization. And to this day, the women of northern Mali are still loyal to that group, to the fact that they actually took over the airport in Kidal on behalf of Al-Qaeda. So if we think there's no security threat, and we think women are victims waiting to be saved, we need to change our thinking. And we need to understand that security is aligned with climate change, and women have to be at the center of that conversation. Because if we're not, we're going to lose an awful lot in the future.
Thank you so much. That so powerful what you just said. And picking up on your point about the floods in Pakistan, we worked with a midwife during those floods who, in the space left by government and institutions where everything had collapsed, systems had collapsed, was traveling for days upon end on boats and all sorts to reach communities to deliver care, and reaching like thousands and thousands of pregnant women and newborns who are completely cut off with no one to support. And so it just goes to the importance of local women leaders in these situations who figure out solutions. There's no money there for it. But if you have those systems and if you have mechanisms to drive funding and support to these types of groups, it changes things. So really powerful. I want to talk to you a little bit more about the money element. So we know that despite all of this, when it comes to violence against women, the money just isn't matching the talking points. So why do you think that is, and how do we change that?
because we're not really, truly interested in the prevention and protection of women. I think when it comes, and I've worked on this agenda for over 20 years, and it's the same amount of money that we got back then, we're getting now, right? It has not changed. And I think we have to go back to look at the money. We have to understand what's important to us, because what's important is what you fund. And the idea that understanding that violence against women is not just an insular, personal issue, but it is an interconnected community and national issue that can increase or decrease your law and order, that it has impact across the nation and internationally. And I think until we start recognizing, I mean, if we look at rape and the prison sentences given for rape as compared to the white-collar crime, recently in the US, a guy was put away for 50 years for fraud, and yet rapists can get 5 to 6 years. If we see this in a parallel, the value of women's bodies is so small and inconsequential. We have to start valuing and respecting women. And we have to have women respect themselves. And we have to work with empowerment and work with understanding and unpacking the myths and the assumptions, and then we can hopefully start getting the money in to match with that knowledge. And I think we need to be a little bit more courageous in calling things out and a little bit more courageous in pushing for accountability.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Luca, I'm coming over to you. Can you talk to us a little bit about the nexus between climate and the WPS agendas and how we mitigate the effects of conflict and climate?
Thank you, Rachel. Well, first of all, I join those who already congratulated Kosovo for organizing this wonderful event. And I would also like to express my amazement at the quality of this panel. What you have here, I want to stress this, but you have civil society organizations, you have private sector, there is government, there is academia. That's exactly what we need. So it's a multi-stakeholder approach that will lead us to a better implementation of the WPS agenda. I may get back to that, but going back to your question, the nexus between WPS and climate change has been increasingly important in the global debate over the last few years. Let's not forget that WPS is only 24 years old if we start with Resolution 1325. And in the recent UN Security Council resolutions, you have specific references to climate change. Let me mention 2242 of 2015, which is one of the most important, in my view, UN Security Council resolutions on the matter. And it refers specifically to challenges, including the importance of strategic communication, the threat of violent extremism, and the global impact of climate change. And from there, it piles up because, for instance, in last year's Agenda for Peace, there is a specific reference made to the need to address the interlinkages between climate change, peace and security, to possibly define preparedness and response plans. So let's say the awareness is there, so that's the good part. I would like to just make reference to a few figures. The World Food Programme warned just last week, I think, that nearly 55 million people in West and Central Africa will struggle to feed themselves during the next summer season. And that's an increase of 4 million in the number of food insecure people as compared to the previous forecast, which was published in 2023. So that's how big the phenomenon is. And I want to quote the UN Secretary General. I will read this bit because I think it's relevant to our discussion today. I quote, "Climate disasters and conflict both inflame inequalities, imperil livelihoods, and force people from their homes. that can strain relations and sow discontent. While diminished resources and mass displacement can intensify competition, conflict can easily be sparked where tensions are high, institutions are weak, and people are marginalized. And women and girls pay the highest price, just as they do when food is short and climate disasters hit. So I think this covers the concept pretty much. And then let's look into actions. I think that women's full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation in not only in peace processes and conflict-related activities, but I would say to all spheres of political, economic, and social life, is the antidote. Because by empowering women and having women present at the table when it comes to decision-making, you automatically diminish and overcome the impact of those global challenges. We have statistics there as well, I like numbers, showing that, for instance, peace agreements have 35% higher likelihood of being long-term solid when women are involved in them. That's quite remarkable. In concrete terms, I think the integrated approach, the multi-stakeholder approach that I was referring to in the beginning is the way to go. Engaging women, including frontline women and marginalized women, as it has been mentioned, in conflict prevention and peace building. Then we have things that we can do at national level, and I refer here to national action plans. There's more than 100 now countries in the world, so more than 50%, which have a national action plan for women, peace, and security. But guess what? Only 1 or 2 dozen of them include references to climate change. So maybe there's some homework here to do. Then there's the international level, and I wish to take this opportunity also to mention the role that not only the UN but also regional organizations play in this regard. And finally, I think it's very important to stress the linkages. We were discussing this before the panel, women, peace and security, but I also cover youth, peace and security. Well, I would invite everyone not to consider them as competitors for attention, for funding, etc. I think the two agendas can be complementary and they can help each other.
Thank you, Luca. And yes, just coming back to your point about the widening of the agenda, the inclusion of youth, and that I think that we all come from this scarcity mindset because resources are so scarce. Any addition to an already small pot there's concern there, which needs to be navigated. But it also goes back to the fact that there needs to be more resources. And you mentioned the national action plans. Those national action plans also need a budget. And often that is not the case as well. And so with all of this, it feels like so often we're almost set up for success. We're given the action plans. We're given, there's the right talk, there's the right conversation going around it. But when it actually comes to implementation, we're left alone. And so I think that's something that's really important as a takeaway, that it needs to be, the action plans need to include climate, they need to have budgets. One more question for you, if I may, and that's around the role of technology. Because I know you've spoken about that a little bit in the past. So I'm just interested in the role of technology in prevention and mitigation, and what are some of the things that you're seeing on that horizon in the global discourse?
If I may go back to your point on budgets, probably a minority of national action plans include budgets. This said, there's other ways. Italy is among those having a budget in the national action plan. But I recently learned from one of the best, I must say, Finland, that they don't have a specific budget because they draw from the single budgets of the ministries involved in the implementation. So that's also another way to go. Mm-hmm. I'm not pro one or another. Probably it depends on the country. I'm glad you mentioned technology in a positive way, because in the debate over WPS, recently there's a lot of, rightfully, discussion on tech-facilitated sexual violence, tech-facilitated gender-based violence, which is, of course, a horrible phenomenon which needs to be fought in every possible way. But it's important to mention that the role of technology can be very, very beneficial to this agenda and also to the nexus between climate change and women, peace and security. For example, it is a means to increase spaces for political engagement by women through technology. There is a possibility to have more transparency because information flow in a much broader way. There is more accountability because everything is visible. There is also knowledge sharing, which is crucial to anyone wishing to implement the agenda or contribute to the agenda's implementation. And then there is a direct role of technology in each of the 4 pillars of the agenda. So in terms of participation, but also protection of women and girls, prevention, and relief and recovery. So we have to think of technology also as an enabler for positive implementation rather than just as a threat, as often happens.
Thank you. I just want to invite any of my other panelists to comment on the technology piece because I know it's probably intersecting with our work in many different ways. Manira, do you want to make a comment? No, before.
It's definitely a double-edged sword because working as we do with girls and women leaders, the online violence is forcing girls and women out of leadership more and more, right? And the climate activist, for example, is destroyed online first. So yes, there is that whole growing piece with disinformation and the science and climate debate, right? And the divisions that we are seeing. But at the same time, as you say, especially for climate, early flood warning, a lot of the science-based kind of solutions that technology is ushering in to help communities is again phenomenal. But we are seeing that online violence is really taking a toll, and the numbers that we have been trying to increase at decision-making tables and in all these spaces is actually starting to come down. So just wanted to flag that.
Of course, and I agree on the double-edged sword. I think there's many things that technology can do for us, many of which you explained. But the way in which it has been leveraged by authoritarian far-right regimes to disrupt and dismantle a lot of the efforts and strategies and long-term work that has been gone on by the women's movement has been very successful. And like disinformation, misinformation campaigns have been wonderfully successful in dramatically impacting the work that many movements have spent many decades. And much of the progress that has been achieved over those decades has been sort of wiped out with the use of technology. But again, I think there's a lot of work to be done by the feminist communities and by other actors to really understand how to leverage it in the best way. And again, I think that often comes down to resourcing because we don't have the same resources as far-right authoritarian regimes. And so we don't have the money to be spending on campaigns, digital campaigns to go back against them. So that's certainly I'm very interested in. But it's a huge, it's like the metaverse, right? It's like a whole other space in which we've got to figure out and come up with good strategies on. Okay, thank you, Luca. And coming to you, Viola, I want to talk a little bit about political will and how do we move beyond the box-ticking exercise that many of these agendas are and ensure women's participation and empowerment are central to WPS agendas.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm just coming back from a 2-week trip from Ukraine. I spent a lot of time, especially with those women who are, have been refugees or IDPs, or who are also my colleagues in the Ukrainian Radar, who work on the front line and at different positions. And it's all about that. It's all about how can we make sure that the social fabric, which will be, and what we've heard today on stage and yesterday, even after 25 years, is still super difficult with the existing trauma, with all the layers of the society who had experienced what kind of social abuse and many other war criminals. And here we are still in the middle of it. We don't know the outcome. And from the European Parliament, we have set up a so-called Ukraine facility with 50 billion, and everything is in there. So on paper, it looks super good. But if you speak to the people, and especially to the women on the ground, they are very much afraid that they will be abandoned. That in the end, men super well know how to circumvent all the boxes, but make sure that the money is channeled in a way which mainly benefit them. And so I would say we have a big task ahead of us to make sure that we do not just appease and comfort ourselves in preparing good papers, academic studies, having statistics on the ground, but also make sure that we have a monitoring and oversight, a control mechanism on the ground, that what is needed will be allocated to those people who are most vulnerable. And when I've heard today of this terrible femicide and the second one in a few days, I realized that here is also a large group of women, obviously outside of the bigger cities and maybe threatened by traumas, by some other, let's say, reasons in the society which had not worked on. Even we are supporting this country, I would say the international community, everyone, bilaterally, European Union, USA, and so on, but have not managed to make sure that those groups which were affected the most, maybe not this 21-year-old girl, but maybe her mother, maybe her aunt, maybe somebody else, and has not managed, or the community has not managed to make sure that women get the best education, that women get the best health care, that women have access to their own accounts, that they have access to labor market, and that equality is really also implemented. And here, I would say, I don't want to blame anyone for that. I mean, we are all responsible. We from the politician side, we on the national, on the European, on all the different levels. But I see that even we speak a lot, we raise the awareness, we have many, I would say, international faces on our side. But when it comes to the decision, and that was made to me very clear in Ukraine, where the money will go, this will be decided by men. Yeah? And now when we have the next layer of climate change, I mean this flooding of all the hydropower stations made the life for hundreds of thousands of people unlivable. They had to leave their homes from one minute to the other, plus the daily bombing, the shelling, and so on. And I've also spoken to people on the front line where, I mean, people live in shelters for months, for years now. Mainly the women stayed, and they're very committed to stay, and there's obviously no future. I mean, the whole village, the whole settlement is in rubble, but nevertheless, they would like to stay. And of course, they asked me, what is the European Union? What are you going to do for us? We might become a member state, but how will look our future like? And of course, it's super difficult to give a concrete answer, but I feel obliged to work for them and to make sure if I go back to Brussels, I get this first-hand information and I do something with it. And next time we speak to the Commission, we speak to the European Council, we speak to those people who disseminate the money, ask them who has, in the end, benefited from the money, who has received these funds, what have you done with this gender budgeting, what is the mainstreaming like in Ukraine, in Kosovo, in other countries, how has educational system changed through our money. And I think with this, we have not been committed enough in the last years. So I think there's a lot for us, and I would not say anyone, I don't want to single anyone out. I think this is us as women, but also as the international community, to make sure that the most vulnerable really receive the money which they deserve and which they need. And in these conflict areas, it's even more difficult to make sure that you have this proper oversight, monitoring system, and so on in place.
Thank you, Viola. And I think, yeah, I think I was speaking a little bit with you, Claire, about this earlier, about really needing to understand the limitations of the traditional aid architecture so that we can both expand it and create new pathways to be more impactful. And I think so much of it is upon the institutions, the bilateral donors, the governments within that traditional aid architecture to be intentionally looking for new ways of doing things and building different types of partnerships that enable money to move better and for each dollar to be more impactful in its work. Because that seems to be, in whatever space I'm in, the same conversation over and over again. It's no different here from any of the gender justice sessions that I am involved in. So yeah, it's definitely something that I think there needs to be a more intentional focus of the more institutional partners in this collective effort to deliver gender justice. I'm going to come around, we've got 13 minutes, with a final question, which is, from the work that you're doing currently and the work that you're seeing through the partnerships or the networks that you are involved in, what are reasons for us to be optimistic in this era of the poly crises? So what are strategies that you're seeing, work that you're seeing, individuals that you've come across that are giving you reasons to be optimistic, and that can give all of us who are involved in this work reasons to be optimistic? And Minera, if you're happy, I'm going to start with you.
I have a big smile on my face for the simple reason that when those who have been historically denied access to power actually come closer to it, they navigate it differently and they do a phenomenal job with it. So it's interesting to see that in the climate crisis, we now find a lot of the solutions are in the hands of the indigenous people, right? And for years, those who were kind of pushed aside and erased, now everyone's going back to them and saying, tell us about regenerative agriculture, for example. What are the solutions? How are we going to do this? So to me, that is huge. It's like we've come full circle, and it's lovely to see intergenerational movements building up. I very specifically say girls and women leaders, because in climate, the average age is really dropping, right? And seeing that intersectional approach is something that I enjoy and has given a new bounce to my step, I would say.
Thank you, Minera. Anik?
Yeah, I'm an academic, so I tend to be pessimistic, but I do think, I wanted to say one thing, picking up the Ukraine point, and then I'll get to the optimism. But I think one of the things that I'm hearing from feminist activists on the ground is that the international community keeps insisting on training them.
Yeah.
And they're like, we don't need training. We have been doing this for a long time, right? But training is one of these box-ticking exercises where you can say, like, oh, I've trained 10 people or something. But that's not really what is needed. So there's sort of like listening, right, to activists, to girls, to boys. I mean, listen and sort of, we need to do a little bit better of how we assess the sort of, and I know it's really difficult, I mean, for researchers as well. I mean, yes, we talk about how peace processes seem to be, as an academic, I have to say, the indications from the little evidence that we have seem to indicate, like this is sort of, it's not that because we have so few peace processes where women are included, we don't actually really have that much evidence. But what we have looks promising. So I think we need to maybe have a little bit more faith that actually when we partner with local activists and with people who know their communities, that they will know how to sort of use the money rather than us having particular indicators. I think the other thing, I think the intergenerational aspect, I think is really important also for the kind of networks that I was talking about. And technology, of course, comes into that because technology makes also these networks possible in some ways. Like it's actually possible to, now we are all very used to like be on Zooms or Teams or whatever, and we can have these conversations without necessarily getting on a plane. So those are really interesting, but I also think, and this is interesting with regard to the new centers of excellence, or Center for Excellence one here in Kosovo, is that finding ways to institutionalize, and this has happened in so many ways over the last 24 years with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but to institutionalize thinking and action on these issues in various ways, whether it's at universities, whether it's in governments, whether through NAPs or other things. I think these are really, really important ways to continue to do the work and to sort of bring it to the next generation, pay it forward. So I think that's a really important aspect to sort of make it last beyond the few people that are in this room or in the next room.
Thank you, Annick. Is it possible for someone to shut the back door? Because the noise is quite a lot. Thank you so much. And going back to your point about faith in the grassroots activists, I think that in philanthropy, where they're able to be a lot more risky, or take more risks with their investments, you're seeing trust-based philanthropy is a huge area of work and yielding amazing results. Long-term unrestricted funding is the big call to philanthropy, and it's achieving big results. Bilateral donors, government donors aren't able to take those types of risks, but I think there's a lot of co-learning to be done in how do we evolve the mechanisms of bilateral donor funding to be able to give in that way, because I think that the feminist groups and actors have never had the resources to be able to manage or navigate the traditional aid architecture. It's not something that they know, and then are suddenly required to evidence their work or measure their work against these different systems. And so there's just a lot of unlearning that needs to be done, I think, but also sort of, a two-way dialogue in order to rethink what these systems need to be and what success looks like in general. But it wasn't the point. Luca, please, what gives you reason to be optimistic?
I'll give you 3 reasons why I think we should be optimistic from my perspective. One is the level of awareness at government level, but also at international level. I mentioned this before, but just to name a few examples, NATO just produced a new Women, Peace and Security policy, which is supposed to be endorsed at the Washington summit this summer. The EU is doing great work in this field, and many other organizations. The second reason would be the proliferation of regional and local initiatives. Center of Excellence has been mentioned, but I would also like to mention the various networks of women mediators that are appearing, like mushrooming in every single region or continent. Italy is a big supporter of the network of women mediators in the Mediterranean, which was launched in 2017. But in the meantime, there's been many more appearing, and now you have a full map with a Nordic network, a Pacific network, an ASEAN network, African networks, and so on and so forth. And there's even a global alliance of them. So that's another reason. And the third, last but not least, is the commendable and never-ending engagement by civil society organizations, especially women's organizations, who are really the driving force of this agenda, and I think it will continue to be so, because governments can only implement what comes from deep at the grassroots level in society. And I think women's organizations are very well placed to convey these messages.
Thank you, Luca. Claire, over to you.
I think I was born a grumpy pessimist, so I work on women, peace and security. It's a perfect job. I am cautiously optimistic. I will say over the last 20 years of working in this agenda, I've seen just sweeping changes that have been great. Working here in Kosovo 5 years at the beginning of it and seeing, you know, the differences that Kosovo has introduced and some of the most progressive policies and strategies and thinking, and the incredible civil society that is here. But I'll be quite frank, the Women, Peace and Security agenda has stagnated. It is not going any further. So my optimism, that's my cautious point, the optimism comes from seeing things like climate change in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, or at least in the same conversation, and then looking at technology, artificial intelligence, extremism, terrorism, looking at food insecurity, human security. If these can all be integrated into this agenda and they can work together, I think we have got a really good momentum to build on to make drastic changes where they're needed. Because all of these things are security issues and they all have a gender perspective. The problem is we're just not talking enough about it or doing it, which I would prefer to see. So while I am cautious, and I always bring people back to the reality, because we can't just say, oh, it's great and we've done this and done this, because then you sit in your laurels. We need to do more, and we need to do it faster. And we can't just applaud ourselves every International Women's Day and say, you know, this is great and look what we're doing. So while I am cautious, I do believe we are going to go further. And I think we have some phenomenal leaders in this field, and I think we have some phenomenal allies, men as well. So I believe we're going to make change.
Thank you, Claire. Viola?
I think a conference like this makes me rather optimistic, and I see this, especially the stages and the panels with Kosovo women. I mean, their experience, their voices, their knowledgeable contribution to the society have always made a difference, national-wide, but also on the international level. That is super important. Yesterday, there was another example. I took the liberty to visit a project where an American representative built up a Roma rugby team, and to make sure that Roma girls have a self-determined life, and through sport, through rugby, have a part in the society, which they normally would rather not have. And I think this minority, these more marginalized groups, we need to integrate them more systematically in the society, especially girls. Make sure they're not there to be married, to clean the house and to cook, but they are an equal part of each society, no matter whether this is in Kosovo or any other country. And here I see you have a lot of role models. But instead of teaching and lecturing, just box ticking, just support those which are existing. And here I think sometimes a little bit less bureaucratic way of accessing funds and other things would be super easy for those groups, for those projects. And here I see a little bit of room for maneuvering, but we have a lot of role models which we can follow.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of my panelists. Thank you to the government of Kosovo, and thank you to the organizers.